Why did the US withdraw from Afghanistan? How has the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine affected this country? How has the threat of terrorism evolved in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over? What is the status of women's rights in this country under the Taliban's regime? I am Nakhavali, and this is Middle East Analitika. Professor Rahimi, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
The United States evacuated the last of its troops from Afghanistan in August 2021, bringing the country's military engagement to an end after almost 2 decades. Why did the US withdraw from Afghanistan?
I think it fundamentally came down to the perception that the war is unwinnable, that despite high number of troops and large amount of investments in the country, the goal of establishing a political system that could function on its own independently seemed not achievable, at least not through military means. That pushed the US presidents, starting with Obama, to start negotiating with the Taliban and find a negotiated end to the conflict, right, when they realized the military option may not be viable. Under Obama, generally the idea was that there needs to be some more military gain before the peace process could succeed to get the upper hand. And that, to some extent, limited how much effort was put in the peace process. Trump, when he came to office, he felt that the sense in the US was that they wanted the war to end as soon as possible. So he was less patient and was much more eager to end the conflict. He appointed a special envoy to negotiate with the Taliban. Even with that special envoy, he was convinced that he should continue the military option. He should continue military support and keep the troops in the country, even though it might have been against his instinct. That process, the process of that was later became known as Doha process, resulted in a finalized deal, which was finalized close to time when Trump's term ended. And Biden basically inherited that deal, which required the U.S. troops to withdraw from Afghanistan. And in exchange, the Taliban promised not to attack U.S. troops. So basically, hostilities between the U.S. and Taliban, and by extension, NATO, would end. And there was some less kind of firm commitment that the Taliban would try to negotiate with the internationally recognized Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Biden, I think, decided that he should keep the deal. He changed the deadline, but he decided to keep the deal, hoping that the negotiation between the Taliban and Afghan government would succeed in reaching some sort of compromise and having a government that had Taliban as a part of it, but also the elements that were in power for the past 20 years also could be kept as a part of the political system. Also, he basically decided on a larger level that the Afghanistan and having so much troops and in resources tied up in Afghanistan did not reflect the U.S. Security priorities anymore. The U.S. strategic securities, looking outside of the world, looking at China, looking at the emerging threat of Russia, did not. Afghanistan did not figure so prominently in that image. Finally, he made a decision to withdraw all the troops, hoping that the negotiation would succeed, hoping that the government could stand on its own. As we saw, that did not materialize. Those hopes did not materialize for a whole host of reasons. And even before all the troops were withdrawn from the country, the Afghan government that was supported by international forces collapsed. We can get to why that happened, but it was a complicated process. I just would like to say that there was an option on the table, and that was the option from the quote-unquote U.S. establishment to keep the minimum number of troops in Afghanistan. Because at the time when Biden decided to withdraw, the number of troops were very, very small. We were talking about a couple of thousand. And the idea was that even if there's no winnable outcome, even if it's a stalemate, it may be better than the possible alternative, which have been return of Taliban to power, which could then embolden and empower those terrorist groups that have animosity with the West, and also the regressions that could happen on issues of rights. So the idea was that even if we cannot win the war, we can have this stalemate with minimum cost in terms of U.S. soldiers and investment, and that may be actually preferable to what would happen if we withdrew and Taliban returned to power. I think Biden finally decided that no, that is not the calculation he bought into, and he decided to withdraw all troops and basically disengage from the country militarily. And his decision factored in all those costs. It seems like he was comfortable enough that the terrorist groups that could pose threat to the U.S. could be kept at bay with some over-the-horizon capabilities, meaning drone and surveillance, and some sort of trust, or maybe some hope that the Doha deal, where Taliban committed not to let Afghanistan be used against the U.S., could be held with some incentives like investments and money and aid to the group.
Right. So Taliban took over with almost no resistance externally. But I remember that there was resistance by the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan in Panjshir region. How is the situation now?
You have to put it in context. Obviously, this has been a war of attrition for a very long time. There were 20 years of fighting going on, close to 20 years. And Afghanistan National Security Forces fought the Taliban in a very bloody battle. Both sides lost a lot over many, many years. I mean, the figures are in hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the Afghan side being killed. Also, there were local resistance here and there before Taliban took over. Herat, where I'm from, Ismail Khan, a former commander, tried to organize popular resistance against the Taliban. But you're right that eventually Taliban were able to overcome all of those. The national security forces collapsed once the support from the international community withdrew for a whole host of complex psychological reasons, like the loss of morale, and also logistical reasons, because this logistical system was set up to depend on the continued support in terms of intelligence, in terms of material support, in terms of air support, based on the presence of international forces. But you're right, the Taliban takeover kind of happened fairly fast as soon as the troops and international support kind of dialed down. But you're right that even after Taliban took over Kabul, that was August 15, they took over Kabul, that last major city, still there was a pocket of resistance focused in Panjshir, which is a small territory north of Kabul. And that resistance lasted for a while, weeks. Taliban first tried to negotiate an end to that resistance. The negotiations failed because Taliban were basically asking them to surrender in exchange for safety. So there was really no offer of inclusion in political system on the table for the resistance, which consisted of elements of former Mujahideen, freedom fighters that had fought the Russians and the Taliban prior to 2001, as well as some elements of the national security forces of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So that was kind of the coalition that was holding the Panjshir. Eventually, Taliban forced it. They threw everything they had to the valley and were able to take over at least the center of the city. Some elements of resistance spread to mountains and other places, and they turned to a guerrilla kind of warfare instead of trying to hold the territory. And that is the status quo right now. There are some guerrilla warfare going on, some assassinations, some activities, but there is really no major organized attempt to even take over and then hold a territory. They tried that a couple of times. They tried to hold Panjshir, and then they tried to hold certain districts around northern Afghanistan. But those failed, given that Taliban were able to mobilize overwhelming number of troops to crush those. Now that they have transferred to guerrilla warfare. How active they are, how many operations they conduct varies, but generally they're not perceived as a major existential threat to Taliban rule. Not yet. The NRS, the short for National Resistance Front, is hoping to be able to mobilize more domestic support, more international support, so they can actually do more. But they are not there yet. No, not in terms of domestic support and not in terms of international sponsorship yet.
Right. Now let's talk about diplomacy with Taliban's regime. We know that there have been official talks. You mentioned Doha talks with Taliban, but yet no country has taken the step of granting diplomatic recognition to the Taliban's government. I don't know if there is any updates on that status now. So how has the international community engaged with the new Taliban-led Afghanistan, and what challenges have emerged in diplomacy with the Taliban's regime?
As you pointed out, no state has taken the step to formally recognize Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. Even those who had recognized the group the first time they ruled the countries in the 90s, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan recognized the first emirate, that is the title of the state that Taliban have chosen. But this time, there's been a unanimity in the international community not to formally recognize the Taliban. But engagement has been going on from the start. As you pointed out, there was a lot of engagement around Doha and became a hub for the international community and regional countries to engage with the representation of the Taliban, a diplomatic representation of Taliban. Once Taliban moved to Kabul, there were some splits. Some countries continued to engage with Doha, and Taliban have a diplomatic presence in Doha. But many and most kind of shifted to engaging with Taliban in Afghanistan. All the countries in the region kept their embassies open and have in exchange accepted diplomats appointed by the Taliban. They don't recognize Taliban as a government, but they have recognized diplomats appointed by the Taliban in the respective embassies in the region. Beyond the region, US is the only country that has not engaged with the Taliban inside Afghanistan. They continue to engage through Doha office. They meet, for example, just today, they were announced that Tom West, the special envoy for issues of Afghanistan, is meeting along with Miss Amiri, who's the special envoy on women's rights, meeting with Taliban officials in Doha. Also, the US engages with Taliban inside Afghanistan through Qatar officials. So Qatar is looking after interest of US in Afghanistan, the same dynamic that Switzerland has with regard to Iran. But other European countries have engaged inside Afghanistan and in Doha. UK officials do travel to country. European officials do travel to country. EU has opened its mission in Afghanistan. European countries and the United States have not accepted any representatives from the Taliban in the embassies, but they hosted some events where Taliban officials were present. For example, Norway hosted events where Taliban officials were present. So the bottom line is there's a lot of engagement going on, and their goals for engagements vary. Sometimes it's just to persuade Taliban to respect women's rights. Sometimes it's to ensure and protect the interest of citizens of European and American who are left in Afghanistan. Sometimes the goal is to help facilitate the evacuation of those who worked with the NATO allies in Afghanistan and the United States in Afghanistan. And sometimes the goal is CT, counterterrorism, because counterterrorism concerns are ongoing, and countries have to rely on Taliban on some level to actually monitor and then take actions within the territory of Afghanistan, since Taliban control the territory. So that is the dynamic. Inside Afghanistan, also UN has stepped up its role, because no country is giving aid to Afghanistan through the government anymore. So the aid to the country does not go through the official budget of the government. Everything is off the budget, and the UN is taking the lead on that. So all the aids go through the UN, and then the UN is supposed to be coordinating the suspension and implementation of those aids, which is very obviously important given that the country's economy almost collapsed, and there are dire needs in terms of food security and such.
Right. Sorry.
No problem.
Sorry. Okay. Now let me ask you about the regional powers. Do we have any indications of support or resistance from regional powers? We know that, I remember that Iran and Afghanistan came to some tensions over water resources some months ago. So how regional powers received a new regime in Afghanistan?
So during the insurgency, before Taliban took over, there is ample evidence that Pakistan and Iran actively supported the Taliban. Even some Central Asian countries provided material support in exchange for assurances that Taliban would not allow certain terrorist groups to spill over into Central Asia. So there was regional engagement and support during the insurgency, actively by Pakistan and Iran, because they wanted Iran had its own reasons, because they wanted obviously to make it costly for the Americans to stay, and they were concerned about the U.S. deepening its presence in the country. Pakistan has always seen Taliban as a government more friendly to it compared to the internationally supported Islamic Republic, which Pakistan saw to be more friendly to India, its arch rival. But when Taliban returned, as you pointed out, the relationship became much more complicated. Taliban needs for support from these countries diminished now that they are much more engaged with the international community, and also now that they are no longer in insurgency phase. They don't really face military threats to the rule anymore. So they're not as vulnerable. There have been skirmishes at the borders with Iran multiple times. There's also the ongoing water disputes, as you pointed out. On Pakistan front as well, TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban of Pakistan, has presence in the country, and Pakistan accuses the Taliban of giving safe havens to these elements, and that then they go on and conduct attacks against the Pakistani soldiers inside the Pakistan, and then retreat to Afghanistan. The same dynamic that was going on when Taliban were the insurgency. So Taliban have developed those ties, and now those regions are becoming a problem for Pakistan. So the tables have kind of turned on Pakistan. Central Asian countries as well, they have their own concerns about the elements, because all the Central Asian countries are vulnerable to certain elements of terrorist groups that exist in Afghanistan. And they are vulnerable to those that actually taking their operations across the border. But generally, the approach has been from everyone, including Pakistan and Central Asia and Iran, to work with the Taliban, to try to solve their problems through negotiation. For various reasons, partly because they don't see an alternative to the Taliban. They don't see dislodging Taliban as a real viable option. So they kind of are stuck with the Taliban, and they've tried to find a working solution. For example, despite all those border skirmishes, if you look at the rhetoric with regard to Iran, it's still a rhetoric of diplomatic engagement. There was a lot of high-level exchanges between the countries trying to find a solution to these problems. How long? It's Pakistan the same, despite the attacks. Now the rhetoric is a bit harder on the side of Pakistan because the numbers of attacks on Pakistani soil has increased. But it's still, no country, I think, has shifted to the mode of actively supporting a military resistance against the Taliban. Tajikistan still holds the elements of NRF, the National Resistance Fronts in Tajikistan, but even Tajikistan has not provided much material support for activities inside Afghanistan, even though they were willing to host the elements of anti-Taliban elements within Tajikistan.
Right. Now let's talk about Russian and Ukrainian war. We know that this war has had far-reaching effects on Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis, economy, and also geopolitical dynamics. At least it has diverted attention and resources from Afghanistan. So how, in your opinion, this ongoing war affected Afghanistan?
That is very true. There are many ways. For example, as you pointed out, there's the issue of food security. Ukraine and Russia produced, they were biggest exporters of grains in the world, and the war has disrupted the supply chains and has had a negative impact on food security in most vulnerable places like Afghanistan. There's also the fact that United Nations says they need more than $2 billion to fund their operations in Afghanistan, and they've requested countries to pledge to that fund, but that pledge is below like 10%, or like it was close to 4 or 5% of what is needed was pledged, and that reflects the attention and the interest of the donor countries shifting away from Afghanistan. It has complex reasons. Part of it has to do with the fact that more money, maybe aid, is going to more strategically important areas. But also it has to do with the fact that Taliban have basically disappointed the hopes that through aid, there could be an economic engagement, there could be some change and moderation in Taliban policy. So it's kind of two aspects to it, in my opinion. And there's also concerns about aid effectiveness. So it's not all Ukraine war, but Ukraine also had an impact on the amount of money that goes to Afghanistan. Security-wise as well, it changed the whole dynamic, obviously, in the region. Russia, I think, was on the fence with regard to the Taliban and what Taliban return to power meant for Afghanistan. And there were moments that Russia was not very sure about letting Taliban kind of secure the country and be a secure ruler in the country. But it seems like now that Ukraine has tied down Russia, there's not a lot of leadership from Russian side on the issue of Afghanistan. There's not a lot of possibility that Russia could become much more actively involved in the issue of Afghanistan. Because the hope was that the Russia's involvement as a regional kind of military leader, because China is not very military active, could change the dynamic against the Taliban. Because Russia is very concerned about the spillover of terrorism from Afghanistan to Central Asia, where it sees it as its strategic areas of influence. So it tied down Russia and kind of removed the attention of Russia from that area. It empowered Central Asian countries against Russia, which means they can pursue their own independent policies more than they could before. And all those things, I think, have worked somewhat in favor of Taliban, politically and militarily speaking. But on the humanitarian front, and the effect has been obviously devastating.
Right. Now let me ask you about the status of terrorism. How has the threat of terrorism evolved in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over in 2021, particularly considering the resurgence of terrorist groups like Islamic State Khorasan province?
Yeah, the UN came out with this report, and as you know, UN Security Council has this commission that is supposed to monitor the issues of terrorism in Afghanistan following UN Security Council resolution. It's kind of sanction review process. They were very, very adamant that the risk of terrorism for Afghanistan has increased substantially since Taliban returned to power. It depends on which group we're talking about. For example, Al-Qaeda, they believe, has close ties with the Taliban. The senior leaders of Al-Qaeda are in Afghanistan. Al-Zawahiri, the leader that succeeded bin Laden, was killed by the U.S. in Kabul, reportedly in a safe house owned and operated by the Taliban's Minister of Interior, acting Minister of Interior, Sirajuddin Haqqani. And other Al-Qaeda members are reportedly, according to the UN report, are advising the Taliban, and they have a strong presence in the country. But their understanding is that Taliban are still they are intent to keep the Doha deal, meaning they don't want Al-Qaeda to be using Afghanistan to attack other countries. So the friendly relationships are there, but it seems like Taliban are not supportive of Al-Qaeda than using Afghanistan as a base to attack other countries because they're worried about the backlash against the regime. But the friendly relationships are there, and Afghanistan could become a place where Al-Qaeda recuperates, right? That is the kind of the concern, that it would give a safe haven that they can actually organize. Maybe the attack finally will come from another place, but Afghanistan is going to be part of a place where leadership would feel safe and could actually revitalize the group. But I think everyone agrees that it has not been revitalized yet. The relevance of Al-Qaeda is limited. Then you have regional groups, the groups that are against China, the Uyghurs, the Turks. You have groups that are Taliban of Tajikistan, and then you have these groups. They were always in Afghanistan for a very long time and operated with some level of support by the Taliban, meaning that they were managed by the Taliban. And Taliban are sympathetic to their cause, more or less, and they received support from them, especially during the insurgency. Now, how do they deal with them? I think that's one of the reasons why regional countries are engaging with the Taliban, trying to get the Taliban to at least contain and control them. Generally, Taliban really keep a close, tight kind of control over these groups. For example, they are registered, their guns are registered, so there is a active monitoring going on. They are often given the ability to remain in Afghanistan as under the term refugees. Taliban called them refugees, but they are not really allowed. That is the general analysis. They're not allowed to use Afghanistan and then attack other countries. Taliban, because basically they say that is the line that we promised to the world in Doha that we would not let anyone to use Afghanistan against another country. They did not promise to cut ties. They did not promise to expel these elements. And I'm not sure even regional countries would like them to be expelled, because the question becomes, where do we be expelled to? And Taliban are not willing to hand them over to these governments to be persecuted because they consider them to be fellow mujahids, fellow refugees. Right? And then you have TTP, which is actively present in Afghanistan and actively uses Afghanistan territory to operate against Pakistan. That is the biggest exception to the rule of not use Afghanistan against other countries. And Taliban basically tried to persuade Pakistan to negotiate with TTP and come some kind of settlement to the dispute, because they are at least unwilling or unable to do anything with the TTP because of how deep those relationships are. Lately, there was reports that Taliban promised to the Pakistanis that they would relocate the TTP or the refugees, they call them refugees, from Pakistan border area to other parts of the country. So basically try to make sure they have more control by removing them from areas where they are indigenous to and they have easy access to Pakistan. It's not clear how much success they're going to have, and Taliban have said this is not TTP, just refugees we are relocating, and Pakistan has asked for more action to be taken. So that remains kind of the strongest, the most serious threat to the region in terms of terrorism from Afghanistan. And then you have ISKP. And ISKP is the serious threat to the Taliban because they're actively fighting the Taliban. They have even taken actions against regional countries. They were some rockets that were fired from Afghanistan to Central Asians, and the ISKP took responsibility. And obviously, Iran is very nervous about the threats of ISKP, the Islamic State Khorasan province, to spill over into Iran. There was, as you know, there was an attack in a shrine in Iran that then Iran claimed was linked to a group, the ISKP in Afghanistan. Recently, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said that the leaders of ISIS, the Islamic State, are being transferred to Afghanistan, to which Taliban's Prime Minister said that we don't have borders with those countries, implying that they have to come to regional countries, and therefore it is a responsibility of regional countries to maybe control those transit points. All to say that there's evolving threats of terrorism. It depends on which terrorism group you talk about. Some of them Taliban have promised to manage to the extent possible, and those managements kind of work for some groups more than they do for other groups. And then you have the ISKP, which is actively in fight with Taliban, and also has always tried to bring other regional countries into the conflict in Afghanistan, and hopefully even ISKP hopes to reach beyond Afghanistan, Europe, and the US. That is the reason why Europe and the US still are working with the Taliban, trying to contain the threat of ISKP. So that gives some leverage to the Taliban again in their negotiation with the US and European countries who are afraid of the growing threats of ISKP and Al-Qaeda, because other elements like TTP and Turkestan and those terrorist groups tend to have a regional focus.
Right. As a last question, and if you can answer me in a short way, we have 5 more minutes. And I want to talk to you about one of the most heartbreaking issues in Afghanistan, and that's the issue of women. Taliban's treatment of women and girls changed since their takeover. So in your opinion, we know that women right after Taliban came to power, they were forbidden to go to school, and they were forbidden for attending their jobs. How do you differ this period from the prior period of Taliban treating women?
It is hard to answer that question because Afghanistan changed. Maybe Taliban policy haven't changed. As you pointed out, similar policies are in place that were in the 90s. Girls are banned from education beyond elementary school. That's one difference because first time Taliban ruled Afghanistan, girls were not allowed to go even to elementary school. So that's a slight difference. How important that is, it's a question mark. In terms of Taliban women working, they are banned from working for NGOs and most government sectors. But they are technically allowed to work in private sector. So there's really no official ban on women working in private sector, which is again different from the first time. Although there are restrictions in place in terms of whether they can be outside alone, whether they should be accompanied and such, right? In terms of rules about hijab, like covering the face, like not the ordinary hijab that Muslims wear everywhere, but the complete covering of face, Taliban have issued guidelines, but they are not as vigorously enforced as they were in the 90s. So there are instances of women being harassed and mistreated and even being beaten for the fact of not maintaining their standards, but it hasn't risen to the level that was in the 90s. And they have reasons against it. Afghanistan has changed. So there is more resistance on the ground. Women protest more. I mean, protests were unprecedented in the 90s. I mean, there were no protests in the 90s. First of all, Afghans did not have the language of political protests and civil organizations. That was not kind of a part of the political kind of culture of Afghanistan. It has become part of the political culture. Women have become more politically active. And obviously, the way that the world is integrated more now, like everything that happens on the streets of Afghanistan kind of makes it to the internet, and everyone around the world will be able to see. So there is, I think, constraints on what Taliban can do, and there's a lot more resistance from the population, and it is a function of how the society has changed. I think ultimately the goals of Taliban haven't changed. They still believe that women should remain at home as much as possible. They are against women appearing in public. They are against women working. They rather men work. They are against the education of women beyond the very minimum degree, and that minimum degree they believe should be in religious sciences, not modern sciences, because they believe modern sciences will lead women actually spending more time outside, which they consider to be against the conception of how a good Muslim woman should live their lives. So I think that the blueprint for the society hasn't changed, but the society, again, with which they are trying to implement that blueprint has been transformed. And there are somebody in the Taliban, I think, that are more sensitive to those changes. There's somebody in the Taliban that recognize that Afghanistan has changed, the world has changed, and there should be some level of accommodation. And it's not that they disagree with the other elements. I think they have the similar vision, but they are in disagreement about the method. They're like, there should be more accommodation, there should be more kind of patience. And there are the top leadership of the group who are really believe that those guidelines and those blueprints are rooted in Sharia, and they should be enforced unapologetically, and they should be enforced with maximum force. And they see that as the reason for their 20 years of war, what they call jihad. If you listen, for example, to Minister of Higher Education, which is a close ally of the Taliban supreme leader, he basically made that point, that we did not fight for economic development. We did not fight to, for example, make sure people have a better life in physical sense, like in this worldly sense. Our fight was to establish an Islamic system and to enforce Sharia, meaning that he was dismissing all the arguments that if we go so fast and so hard on these divisive gender policies, which are described as gender apartheid, we're going to maybe face consequences internationally and domestically, but that should not deter us, right? That's one line. And the other line is that no, Afghanistan and the world has changed, and we need to be more understanding within the boundaries of Sharia. So it's not complete like opposite view, but there is at least disagreement on methods within the group. But those dissenters in the group they're not very influential. It seems like when it comes to important policies, decisions are made coming from Kandahar, where the supreme leader and a close circle of ultra-conservative ulama are advising him, religious scholars are advising him.
Professor Rahimi, thank you very much for joining the program, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
You as well, Minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching and listening to us. Please don't forget to subscribe.